Everglades National Park. National Parks of the United States podcast. To understand the Everglades, one must first abandon the traditional concept of a river. When we imagine a river, we typically visualize a distinct channel, a carved groove in the earth, where water rushes audibly from a high point to a low point, bounded by banks and carrying a specific current. The Everglades is a river, but it defies this architecture entirely. It is a sheet of water, vast and shallow, moving with an imperceptible slowness over a limestone bed that tilts so gradually it is nearly flat. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, the writer and conservationist who fundamentally changed how the world viewed this landscape, coined the perfect name for it: the river of grass. This ecosystem is not a swamp, which is a static body of water, nor is it merely a marsh. It is a dynamic, flowing entity, a mosaic of habitats driven by the pulse of water and the cycle of seasons, spanning the southern tip of the Florida Peninsula. Everglades National Park, established to protect the southern portion of this massive biological system, covers approximately 1.5 million acres. It is the largest subtropical wilderness in the United States, the largest wilderness of any kind east of the Mississippi River, and an international biosphere reserve, a World Heritage Site, and a wetland of international importance. Unlike many Western national parks that were protected for their scenic grandeur, the towering granite of Yosemite or the geysers of Yellowstone, the Everglades was the first national park created specifically to preserve a fragile ecosystem. Its value lies not in vertical topography, but in horizontal biodiversity. To comprehend the biological richness here, we must look at the geologic floor. The stage for the Everglades was set during the Pleistocene epoch. Between 100,000 and 10,000 years ago, interglacial periods caused sea levels to rise and fall repeatedly. When the seas were high, the Florida platform was submerged, allowing marine calcium carbonate to accumulate, forming the limestone bedrock known as the Miami Limestone and the Tamiami Formation. This rock is porous, like a rigid sponge. It allows water to seep down into the aquifer and, conversely, allows groundwater to well up. This bedrock is the foundation of the entire park. It is not deeply buried. In many places, it is exposed, rough and pitted, while in others, it is covered by only a thin veneer of peat or marl soil. The hydrological engine of the historic Everglades began far to the north, near present-day Orlando, with the Kissimmee River. Rainwater would fill the Kissimmee chain of lakes and flow south into Lake Okeechobee, a vast, shallow inland sea. During the wet season, the lake would spill over its southern rim, creating a sheet of water up to 60 miles wide but often only inches to a few feet deep. This sheet moved south down the gentle slope of the peninsula, a gradient of only about 2 inches per mile, until it reached the Florida Bay and the Gulf of Mexico. This journey took months. Today, Everglades National Park preserves the southern tail of this system, though the flow has been dramatically altered by human engineering. The climate that drives this system is subtropical, defined not by 4 seasons but by 2, the wet season and the dry season. The wet season, roughly from May through November, brings distinct weather patterns. The humidity rises, and convective thunderstorms build in the afternoons, dumping massive amounts of fresh water onto the landscape. This is when the river flows. The water levels rise, spreading out into the sawgrass prairies and rehydrating the sloughs. Then comes the dry season, from December to April. The rains cease, and the water levels slowly recede. The landscape dries out, concentrating aquatic life into shrinking pools, which triggers a feeding frenzy for wading birds. This hydroperiod, the duration and depth of water presence, is the master variable determining which plants grow where and which animals survive. The flora of the Everglades is a study in adaptation to these fluctuating water levels. The defining visual element of the park is the sawgrass prairie. Despite its name, sawgrass is not a true grass. It is a sedge, scientifically known as Claudium jamescens. It gets its common name from the microscopic, razor-sharp silica teeth that line the edges of its long, triangular blades. These serrations can easily slice through clothing and skin. Sawgrass is incredibly resilient. It thrives in the shallow, slow-moving water, forming dense monocultures that stretch to the horizon, turning golden in the winter and vibrant green in the summer. It is adapted to the nutrient-poor waters of the Everglades. This system is naturally oligotrophic, meaning it is low in nutrients, particularly phosphorus. The native plants, like sawgrass, have evolved to survive on very little. When agricultural runoff introduces excess phosphorus into the water, sawgrass is often outcompeted by cattails, which grow in dense, impassable walls and alter the flow of water and movement of wildlife. Interspersed within the sawgrass prairies are deeper channels of water called sloughs. The two main sloughs in the park are the Shark River Slough and the Taylor Slough. These are the main arteries of the River of Grass, where water flows slightly faster and stays deeper year-round, even during the dry season. Because they hold water longer, sloughs support different plant communities, including whitewater lilies and spatterdock, and they act as critical survival refuges for fish and aquatic invertebrates when the surrounding prairies dry up. One of the most vital yet overlooked components of the slough and prairie ecosystem is periphyton. To the casual observer, it looks like yellowish-brown floating scum or gray sludge attached to plant stems. In reality, periphyton is a complex microecosystem of algae, cyanobacteria, microbes, and detritus. It is the primary producer of the Everglades food web. Periphyton captures energy from the sun and converts it into biomass, providing food for tadpoles, apple snails, insects, and small fish. Furthermore, periphyton is responsible for creating soil. As the calcium-rich water flows over the periphyton, the chemical processes of photosynthesis cause calcium carbonate to precipitate out of the water, forming a mud-like substance called marl. Over centuries, this marl accumulates to form the gray soil found in the prairies. Rising from the flatness of the sawgrass and sloughs are distinct islands of vegetation known as hammocks. These tropical hardwood hammocks are closed canopy forests that grow on slightly elevated ridges of limestone, often only a few feet higher than the surrounding wetlands. That minute elevation difference is enough to keep the trees' roots out of the water for most of the year. The hammocks are dense and jungle-like, populated by trees with West Indian origins, carried here as seeds by birds or storms. Species include the gumbo limbo, often called the tourist tree because of its red peeling bark, the strangler fig, which begins life as an epiphyte in the canopy of a host tree before sending roots down to the ground and eventually engulfing and killing the host, and the poisonwood, a relative of poison ivy with toxic sap. Inside a hammock, the temperature is cooler and the air is still. Ferns cover the floor, and air plants, or epiphytes, cling to the branches. These islands act as dry ground sanctuaries for mammals like deer, bobcats, and black bears during the wet season. Another distinct ecosystem within the park is the pine rockland. These forests grow on the highest, driest ground, primarily on the Atlantic coastal ridge that extends into the park. The dominant tree is the South Florida slash pine, a variety with needles that are incredibly hard and dense wood that is resistant to termites. The pine rockland is a fire-dependent ecosystem. Historically, lightning strikes would ignite fires that swept through the pinelands, burning away the underbrush and hardwood seedlings, while leaving the thick-barked pines unharmed. Without fire, the faster-growing hardwoods would invade and shade out the pine seedlings, eventually turning the pine forest into a hardwood hammock. Today, park rangers use prescribed burns to mimic this natural process and maintain the health of the pinelands. The floor of the pine rockland is incredibly diverse, hosting dozens of endemic plant species found nowhere else on Earth. Moving toward the coast, the water chemistry changes. As the fresh water from the Everglades mixes with the salt water of the Gulf of Mexico and Florida Bay, it creates an estuary environment dominated by mangroves. Everglades National Park contains the largest continuous stand of mangrove forest in the Western Hemisphere. There are 3 primary species here, zonation determined by their tolerance to tidal flooding. The red mangrove is the pioneer, standing knee-deep in the water on arching prop roots that look like spider legs. These roots trap sediment, stabilizing the coastline and actually building land over time. They also provide a critical nursery habitat for thousands of species of fish and invertebrates. The black mangrove grows slightly further inland. It is identified by its pneumatophores, or finger-like projections that stick up out of the mud to facilitate gas exchange for the roots in the oxygen-poor soil. The white mangrove grows on the highest ground of the tidal zone and lacks the distinctive root structures of the other 2. The marine environment of Florida Bay constitutes a significant portion of the park, about 1/3 of its total area. This is a shallow lagoon system with an average depth of only 3 feet. The bay is crisscrossed by mud banks and dotted with mangrove islands. The bottom is carpeted with vast meadows of seagrass, primarily turtle grass and manatee grass. These seagrass beds are the pastures of the sea. They stabilize the bottom sediments, keeping the water clear, and provide food for green sea turtles and manatees. The health of Florida Bay is inextricably linked to the fresh water flowing from the Everglades. If the flow of fresh water is reduced, the bay becomes hypersaline, saltier than the ocean, which can kill the seagrass and lead to massive algal blooms that suffocate marine life. The wildlife of the Everglades is as diverse as its habitats, and the interactions between predator and prey drive the energy flow of the park. The most iconic animal is undoubtedly the American alligator. The Everglades is the only place on Earth where alligators and crocodiles coexist. The American alligator, with its broad U-shaped snout and dark, blackish skin, is a freshwater resident. It is a keystone species, meaning its presence dictates the structure of the ecosystem. During the dry season, alligators use their snouts and tails to clear away muck and vegetation, deepening holes in the limestone. These alligator holes retain water even when the rest of the prairie dries out. They become oases for fish, turtles, and birds, sustaining the food web until the rains return. Without the alligator, these dry season refuges would not exist, and the biodiversity of the park would plummet. In contrast, the American crocodile prefers the salty and brackish water of the coastal areas in Florida Bay. It has a narrower, V-shaped snout and a lighter olive-gray coloration. Once critically endangered, the crocodile population has made a slow recovery within the protected waters of the park and the cooling canals of nearby power plants. They are shy and reclusive animals, far less commonly seen than their alligator cousins. The avian life of the Everglades is spectacular, particularly the wading birds. In the 19th century, the skies over South Florida were darkened by flocks of millions of birds. Plume hunters, seeking colorful feathers for women's fashion, decimated these populations, bringing birds like the snowy egret and the great egret to the brink of extinction. Protection efforts and the establishment of the park allowed numbers to recover, though they are still a fraction of historic levels. The wood stork, a large, bald-headed wading bird, is a key indicator of the Everglades' health. Wood storks hunt by tactile feeling. They sweep their open bills through the water and snap them shut the instant they feel a fish. This feeding strategy requires high concentrations of fish, which only occur when water levels drop significantly during the dry season. If the water levels are manipulated artificially and don't drop at the right time, the fish don't concentrate and the storks fail to nest. The roseate spoonbill is another signature bird, unmistakable, with its bright pink plumage and flat spatula-shaped bill. Like the flamingo, the spoonbill gets its pink color from pigments in the crustaceans it eats. The anhinga is a common sight along the sloughs, often seen swimming with only its long neck and head above water, looking like a snake, which earns it the nickname snake bird. Unlike ducks, anhingas do not have oil glands to waterproof their feathers. This allows them to dive deeper and swim faster to catch fish, but it also means they must sit in the sun with wings spread to dry off and regulate their body temperature. The park is also home to the snail kite, a raptor with a highly specialized diet. It feeds almost exclusively on the apple snail, a large freshwater mollusk. The kite has a curved, hook-like beak perfectly evolved to extract the snail from its shell. This relationship highlights the fragility of the ecosystem. If the water quality degrades and the apple snail population crashes, the snail kite faces starvation. Among mammals, the West Indian manatee is a gentle giant found in the coastal waters and estuaries. These herbivores graze on seagrass beds and can often be seen surfacing for air in the marinas and canals. They are vulnerable to cold stress and boat strikes, making the protected waters of the park a vital sanctuary. On land, the marsh rabbit is a semi-aquatic lagomorph that swims proficiently and hides in the dense vegetation. The most elusive and endangered mammal in the park is the Florida panther. This subspecies of the mountain lion or cougar was once found throughout the southeastern United States, but was hunted and pushed out of its habitat until only a small population remained in the swamps of South Florida. The panther requires large territories to hunt white-tailed deer and feral hogs. In the 1990s, the population suffered from severe genetic defects due to inbreeding. A daring conservation move introduced 8 female cougars from Texas to inject new genetic diversity into the Florida population. The program was successful, and the population has risen, though it remains critically endangered. The panther moves silently through the pinelands and hammocks, a ghost of the wilderness. The balance of the Everglades is also maintained by its invertebrate life. The Florida apple snail, mentioned earlier, lays pink clusters of eggs on plant stems just above the waterline. Crayfish burrow into the mud, aerating the soil and providing food for otters and raccoons. Dragonflies and damselflies patrol the air, preying on mosquitoes. And speaking of mosquitoes, they are an unavoidable reality of the park. While a nuisance to humans, they are a fundamental layer of the food web, their larvae feeding small fish like the mosquito fish, Gambusia, which in turn feed larger fish and birds. However, the Everglades is an ecosystem under siege. The greatest threat comes from the disruption of the natural water flow. For most of the 20th century, the priority of Florida's development was to drain the swamp to create land for agriculture and cities. A massive network of canals, levees, and pump stations was constructed to divert water away from the Everglades and out to the ocean. This successfully prevented flooding in urban areas, and opened up the Everglades agricultural area for sugarcane farming, but it starved the park of fresh water. The timing and quantity of water delivery were broken. In the wet season, water was dumped rapidly into the park, drowning nests and tree islands. In the dry season, water was held back, causing the peat soils to dry out, oxidize, and even catch fire. In addition to water quantity, water quality became a crisis. Runoff from agricultural fields is laden with phosphorus and nitrogen from fertilizers. As this nutrient-rich water entered the oligotrophic Everglades, it disrupted the plant communities. Sawgrass, adapted to low nutrients, was replaced by cattails, which thrive in high-nutrient environments. Cattail marshes are far denser than sawgrass, creating physical barriers to water flow and reducing habitat quality for wading birds. To combat these issues, the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, CERP, was authorized by Congress in 2000. It is one of the largest and most ambitious ecosystem restoration projects in history. The goal is not to return the Everglades to its pre-colonial state. That is impossible given the millions of people now living in South Florida, but to restore the natural hydrologic characteristics. The plan involves removing levees to allow sheet flow, building reservoirs to store water, and treating runoff to remove phosphorus before it enters the park. It is a multi-decade, multi-billion-dollar effort to get the water right. The right quality, the right quantity, the right timing, and the right distribution. Another formidable challenge is the invasion of non-native species. The Everglades is particularly susceptible to bioinvasion due to its subtropical climate and proximity to ports of entry. The most notorious invader is the Burmese python. These massive constrictors, native to Southeast Asia, were likely introduced through the exotic pet trade, either released by overwhelmed owners or escaped during Hurricane Andrew in 1992. They have no natural predators in the Everglades and have proliferated explosively. Pythons are generalist feeders and have decimated populations of small mammals. Studies have shown effectively total declines in the sightings of raccoons, opossums, and bobcats in areas with high python densities. They are even large enough to battle and eat alligators. Park managers and scientists are employing various methods to control the population, from detector dogs to paid python hunters. But the cryptic nature of the snakes makes them incredibly difficult to find in the vast wilderness. Plant invaders are equally destructive. The melaleuca, or paperbark tree, was intentionally introduced in the early 20th century to help drain the Everglades because of its high transpiration rate. It spreads rapidly, forming dense thickets that displace native vegetation and offer little food or shelter for native wildlife. Old World climbing fern is another aggressive invader, a vine that smothers tree islands, climbing into the canopy and acting as a fire ladder that allows ground fires to reach the crowns of trees, killing the mature hardwoods that would otherwise survive a ground fire. Despite these challenges, the Everglades remains a place of profound beauty and resilience. The visual experience of the park is one of subtle shifts. A few inches in elevation change the world from a sawgrass prairie to a hardwood hammock. The light in the Everglades is renowned among photographers and artists. The high humidity diffuses the sunlight, creating soft, luminous sunrises and sunsets that reflect off the water and the clouds. The vast sky is a dominant feature, often filled with towering cumulonimbus clouds that dwarf the flat landscape below. The human history of the Everglades is as deep as its peat soils. Long before drainage projects, the region was home to the Calusa and Tequesta peoples. The Calusa, centered on the Gulf Coast, were a powerful, stratified society of fisher-gatherers. They did not practice agriculture but sustained large populations on the abundance of the estuaries. They built massive shell mounds, some covering tens of acres and reaching 30 feet high, which served as foundations for their temples and chiefs' houses. They engineered canals through the mangrove islands to facilitate canoe travel. The Tequesta lived on the Atlantic coast and similarly adapted to the watery environment. These cultures thrived for thousands of years, but were devastated by diseases introduced by European explorers and were eventually displaced or enslaved. Later, the Everglades became a refuge for the Seminole and Miccosukee people. Forced south by the U.S. military during the Seminole Wars of the 19th century, they found sanctuary in the treacherous, impenetrable wetlands where soldiers could not easily follow. They adapted their lifestyle to the river of grass, living on tree islands in open-sided, thatched roof structures called chickees. They used dugout canoes to navigate the sloughs and hunted for survival. Today, the Miccosukee tribe still lives within the borders of the ecosystem and retains a deep cultural and spiritual connection to the land. The movement to protect the Everglades was distinct from other conservation efforts. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the prevailing American attitude toward wetlands was that they were wastelands, dismal swamps that bred disease and impeded progress. The goal was reclamation, a term that implied the land was defective until drained and turned into farms or real estate. Developers sold swampland in Florida to unsuspecting northerners. The construction of the Tamiami Trail, a road connecting Tampa to Miami across the Everglades, was a feat of engineering that acted as a dam, cutting off the natural water flow. It took a shift in perception to save what remained. Landscape architect Ernest Coe was a tireless advocate who envisioned a park that encompassed the entire watershed. He founded the Tropical Everglades National Park Association in 1928. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas provided the voice. Her 1947 book, The Everglades, River of Grass, was published the same year the park was dedicated by President Harry S. Truman. Truman stood in the town of Everglades City and declared, "Here are no lofty peaks seeking the sky, no mighty glaciers or rushing streams wearing away the uplifted land. Here is land, tranquil in its quiet beauty, serving not as the source of water, but as the last receiver of it." The park's boundaries have evolved over time. Initially, the park did not include enough of the ecosystem to ensure its survival. The East Everglades, an area of critical Shark River slough habitat, was added later to protect the water flow. The interplay between the park and the surrounding human environment is constant. To the east lie the sprawling metropolises of Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and West Palm Beach, home to millions of people who rely on the Biscayne Aquifer for drinking water. This aquifer is recharged by the Everglades. Therefore, saving the Everglades is not just a matter of protecting wildlife. It is a matter of securing the fresh water supply for South Florida. The concept of the solution hole is geologically fascinating and crucial for the park's microhabitats. Rainwater is slightly acidic. When it falls on the limestone bedrock, it slowly dissolves the calcium carbonate, creating pits and holes over thousands of years. These solution holes fill with organic debris and soil. In the pine rocklands, these holes provide a pocket of moisture and nutrients where plants can take root in an otherwise rocky terrain. Ferns and small trees often grow directly out of these holes. In the freshwater marl prairies, solution holes are deeper and act as miniature ponds, sustaining aquatic life. The park is also a place of atmospheric drama. Hurricanes are a natural part of the Everglades cycle. While they can be destructive to human infrastructure, the ecosystem has evolved to withstand them. Hurricanes can topple large trees in the hammocks, creating gaps in the canopy that allow sunlight to reach the forest floor, stimulating new growth. The storm surges push saltwater inland, which can kill freshwater vegetation. resetting the successional clock and maintaining the boundary between the coastal and freshwater zones. The heavy rains associated with tropical systems provide a massive pulse of water that recharges the aquifer and flushes out the estuaries. However, with sea levels rising due to climate change, the impact of storm surges is becoming more profound, pushing saltwater further inland than before and threatening the freshwater peat soils with collapse. Peat soil is formed by the accumulation of dead plant matter in waterlogged conditions. If it is exposed to salt water, the chemical composition changes, and the peat can break down rapidly, leading to land loss. The distinctiveness of the Everglades extends to its acoustic landscape. At dawn in the sawgrass prairie, the sound is a symphony of biological activity. The guttural bellow of a male alligator vibrates the water, creating water dances where droplets jump off the surface. The pig frog grunts like a pig, a sound that echoes across the sloughs. The piercing cry of the limpkin, a bird that feeds on apple snails, carries for long distances. In the mangrove forests, the sound of snapping shrimp in the water mimics the sound of crackling bacon. At night, the chorus of insects and frogs can be deafening, a testament to the biomass and productivity of the wetlands. The Shark River Slough is often called the true Everglades. It is here that the sheet flow is most evident. Looking out over the Shark Valley Observation Tower, one sees the endless sweep of grass and water. The vegetation here is aligned in the direction of the water flow. Tree islands are teardrop-shaped, with the blunt end facing the oncoming water and the tapered tail pointing downstream. This streamlining is a physical record of the water's movement over centuries. Understanding the reproduction of the flora adds another layer of appreciation. The gumbo limbo tree is capable of photosynthesis through its green bark, allowing it to continue producing energy even when it loses its leaves during the dry season. The epiphytes, such as the ghost orchid, rare and elusive, have no contact with the soil. They absorb moisture and nutrients directly from the air and rain through specialized root systems. The ghost orchid has no leaves. Its roots contain chlorophyll and do the work of photosynthesis. It produces a stark white, frog-like flower that seems to float in the dark swamp, pollinated exclusively by the giant sphinx moth, which has a proboscis long enough to reach the nectar deep inside the flower's spur. The intricate relationship between the varying water levels and the breeding cycles of animals is known as trophic dynamics. If the water remains too high during the dry season, fish remain dispersed throughout the prairie. Wading birds, which expend significant energy flying and hunting, cannot catch enough food to support themselves and their chicks. They may abandon their nests entirely. Conversely, if the water drops too fast, the fish may die off before the birds can nest, or the nesting colonies may become accessible to land predators like raccoons, which can swim shallow waters to raid eggs. The Goldilocks scenario, water dropping at just the right rate, is essential for a successful breeding year. The park also protects the largest wilderness area in the eastern U.S., designated as the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas Wilderness. In these designated zones, motorized vehicles are prohibited, and the land is managed to preserve its primitive character. Visitors who canoe or kayak into the backcountry, navigating the nightmare looking for a campsite on a chickie, experience a solitude that is rare in the modern world. The night sky in the interior of the park is dark enough to see the Milky Way, a sharp contrast to the light pollution of the adjacent urban corridor. The Florida gar is a prehistoric-looking fish common in the Everglades waters. It has an elongated body encased in diamond-shaped armor-like scales called ganoid scales. The gar is a survivor. It has a vascularized swim bladder that functions like a lung, allowing it to gulp air and survive in low oxygen waters where other fish would perish. This adaptation serves it well in the warm, stagnant pools of the dry season. Another fascinating interaction involves the American alligator and the birds. Wading birds often choose to nest in trees located directly over alligator holes. This seems counterintuitive, as alligators eat birds. However, the presence of the alligator prevents raccoons and opossums from swimming to the tree to eat the bird eggs. In exchange for this protection, the alligator gets an occasional meal in the form of a chick that falls from the nest. It is a relationship of convenience and mutual benefit, albeit a risky one for the chicks. The soil types of the Everglades are distinct and tell the story of the water. Marl, the gray, clay-like soil of the short hydroperiod prairies, is formed by periphyton in shallower water. Peat, or muck, is dark organic soil formed in deeper water, where plant material decomposes slowly due to lack of oxygen. The deep sloughs have thick layers of peat, while the slightly higher prairies have marl. If the peat dries out completely, it oxidizes and disappears, subsiding the land elevation. This subsidence is a major issue in the drained agricultural areas north of the park, where the ground level has dropped by several feet over the decades. The park's location at the interface of the temperate and tropical zones means it is the meeting place for species from both worlds. Here you find the temperate white-tailed deer and the tropical key deer in the nearby keys. You find temperate maples growing near tropical mahoganies. This biological overlap creates a high density of biodiversity. Restoration efforts also focus on the physical removal of barriers. The Tamiami Trail has been modified with a series of bridges. A 1-mile bridge was completed first, followed by a 2.6-mile bridge. These elevated roadways allow the water to flow freely underneath the road, reconnecting the Shark River slough to the southern Everglades for the first time in nearly a century. This simple act of lifting the road is vital for rehydrating the park and pushing back the saltwater front. The complexity of the Everglades food web extends to the microscopic level. The detritus, decaying plant matter, is broken down by bacteria and fungi, becoming organic matter. This is eaten by amphipods, larval insects, and small crustaceans. These are eaten by mosquito fish, killifish, and grass shrimp. These are eaten by sunfish, gar, and bass. These are eaten by alligators, otters, wading birds, and humans. At every level, the flow of energy is dictated by the flow of water. The cultural history includes the Gladesmen, rugged individuals who lived off the land in the early 20th century, hunting, fishing, and guiding. Their culture was intimately tied to the skiff and the pole boat. While the establishment of the park curtailed their traditional lifestyle by banning hunting and permanent camps, their knowledge of the labyrinthine waterways was often superior to that of the surveyors and scientists. One of the lesser-known habitats is the coastal prairie, located between the tidal mangroves and the interior wetlands. This area is characterized by salt-tolerant vegetation, like succulent halophytes and buttonwood trees. It is a harsh environment, frequently battered by hurricanes and flooded by storm tides. The soil here is often a sticky, salty marl. This zone is critical for the survival of the flamingo, which was once common but is now a rare visitor, and for migratory shorebirds that stop over during their hemispheric journeys. The concept of sheet flow is difficult to grasp without seeing it. It is not a rush of water, but a slow, relentless movement. If you stand in the water in the middle of a slough, you might not feel the current against your legs, but if you drop a leaf, it will slowly drift south. This slow movement allows the vegetation to scrub nutrients from the water, resulting in the pristine, crystal clear quality of the water in the unpolluted central Everglades. It is so clear that one can see the bottom through several feet of water, observing the fish and the limestone. As we look at the challenges of sea level rise, the mangroves play a superhero role. They are capable of peat collapse resistance to a degree. As they drop leaves and trap sediment, they build up the floor of the forest. If the sea level rises slowly, the mangroves can keep pace, building land vertically. However, if the rise is too rapid, the trees drown, the peat collapses, and the land is lost to the open water. This race between biological land building and geological sea level rise will determine the future of the park's coastline. The vastness of the Everglades creates its own weather. The evaporation and transpiration from the millions of acres of wetlands pump massive amounts of moisture into the atmosphere. This moisture fuels the summer thunderstorms that recycle the water back into the system. It is a self-sustaining climatic loop. Development that drains the wetlands disrupts this loop, potentially leading to drier conditions and hotter temperatures for the entire region. In the freshwater prairies, the bladderwort is a carnivorous plant that floats in the water. It has tiny, vacuum-actuated traps that suck in microscopic aquatic invertebrates. This is an adaptation to the low-nutrient environment. Since the plant cannot get enough nitrogen from the soil or water, it harvests it from animal prey. There are several species of bladderwort in the park, flourishing in the sunny, oligotrophic waters. The Florida king snake and the coral snake represent the mimicry found in the park's reptiles. The venomous coral snake has a pattern of red, yellow, and black bands. The non-venomous scarlet king snake mimics this pattern to ward off predators, though the arrangement of the bands differs. The old rhyme, red touch yellow, kill a fellow, red touch black, friend of Jack, helps distinguish them, though visitors are advised to leave all snakes alone. The park's air quality is generally good, but it can be affected by Saharan dust storms that travel across the Atlantic, creating hazy skies and suppressing hurricane formation. This global connection reminds us that the Everglades is not isolated. It is part of a planetary system. The struggle between the invasive Brazilian pepper and the native flora is visible along the margins of the park. Brazilian pepper produces bright red berries that are eaten and dispersed by birds like the robin. It forms dense, tangled thickets that shade out all native plants. Millions of dollars are spent annually on herbicides and mechanical removal to keep this invader at bay. The narrative of the Everglades is one of resilience. It has survived ice ages, droughts, hurricanes, and the relentless pressure of human expansion. It is a place where the boundary between land and water is blurred, where the earth breathes, and where life adapts to the rhythm of the rain. It is a biological treasure house, a testing ground for restoration science, and a spiritual refuge for those seeking the quiet of the wilderness. The river of grass continues to flow, slowly, imperceptibly, carrying the lifeblood of South Florida toward the sea. To fully grasp the magnitude of the Everglades, one must look beyond the immediate visual splendor of the sawgrass and the flash of a heron's wing, delving into the deep chronological layers where the human story and the geological narrative are inextricably fused. This landscape, often perceived as a pristine wilderness untouched by man until the drainage projects of the 20th century, actually holds a human history that spans thousands of years, a saga of adaptation that rivals the biological evolution of the flora and fauna. The water that shaped the limestone bedrock also shaped the societies that lived here, creating a unique cultural ecology where the rhythm of human life was dictated by the rise and fall of the hydro period. The story of human habitation in the Everglades begins roughly 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, during the Paleo-Indian period. At this time, the Florida Peninsula looked vastly different. The Earth was in the grip of the last ice age, and much of the planet's water was locked up in massive glacial sheets at the poles. Consequently, sea levels were as much as 300 feet lower than they are today. The Florida landmass was nearly twice its current width, a vast, arid savanna reminiscent of modern-day East Africa. The Everglades, as a wetland, did not yet exist. Instead, the Paleo-Indians, nomadic hunter-gatherers, roamed a dry landscape dotted with perched waterholes, hunting megafauna that are now long extinct. These early inhabitants stalked mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, and saber-toothed cats across the limestone ridges. Archaeological evidence from this era is rare, often submerged offshore or buried deep in sinkholes, like the warm mineral springs and solution holes where preservation conditions are anaerobic. These sinkholes acted as oases in the dry terrain, drawing both beast and human, and they serve as time capsules, preserving bone and antler tools that testify to a rugged existence on the edge of survival. As the glaciers melted and the Holocene epoch began, roughly 5,000 years ago, the sea levels rose, the climate warmed, and the subtropical rains began to fall with regularity. The rising water table pushed fresh water up through the porous limestone, and the modern Everglades began to form. The arid savanna was replaced by the slow-moving sheet of water, the sawgrass marshes, and the hardwood hammocks. The human populations adapted in turn. The Archaic period saw a shift from nomadic big-game hunting to a more settled lifestyle focused on the exploitation of aquatic resources. This was the dawn of the Glades culture, a distinct archaeological tradition defined by its reliance on the wetland environment. Unlike the agricultural societies of the North that relied on corn and squash, the people of the Glades and the subsequent Tequesta and Calusa cultures thrived almost exclusively on the bounty of the water. They were fisher-gatherers who achieved a level of social complexity, population density, and political hierarchy usually reserved for agricultural civilizations, defying the anthropological convention that farming is a prerequisite for civilization. The Calusa, whose domain centered on the southwest coast but influenced the entire Everglades watershed, are often called the Shell Indians. This name is literal. Lacking hard stone for tools and construction, they utilized the massive whelk and conch shells found in the estuaries. They engineered the landscape on a monumental scale using these shells. They constructed massive shell mounds, some covering over 100 acres and reaching heights of 30 feet, which served as elevated platforms for their chiefs, residences, and temples, keeping them safe from storm surges. These were not merely refuse piles, but deliberate architectural feats. Furthermore, the Calusa were hydraulic engineers. They dug canals through the mangrove islands and the interior wetlands to facilitate canoe travel and trade. One of the most significant archaeological features associated with this trade network is the Mud Lake Canal, a prehistoric engineering marvel that connected the aquatic highways of the 10,000 islands to the interior Everglades. This canal, nearly 4 miles long and 30 feet wide, allowed the Calusa to bypass rough open waters and travel rapidly between settlements, controlling trade routes and military movements. On the Atlantic coast, bordering the eastern edge of the Everglades, lived the Tequesta. Like the Calusa, they were masters of the estuary, harvesting manatees, sharks, porpoises, and vast quantities of mullet and drum. The famous Miami Circle, a bedrock formation carved with post holes found at the mouth of the Miami River, is believed to be the footprint of a massive Tequesta council house or temple. The Tequesta utilized the Everglades as a hunting ground and a travel corridor. They used fire as a tool, much like the modern park rangers, burning the sawgrass prairies to keep them open for travel and to encourage fresh growth that would attract deer. This usage of fire demonstrates a deep traditional ecological knowledge, an understanding that the landscape was not static but required active management to remain productive. The arrival of the Spanish in the 16th century marked the beginning of the end for these indigenous cultures. The Calusa and Tequesta fierce resistance to colonization is legendary. They repelled Ponce de Leon and other conquistadors for decades. However, they could not fight the invisible army of microbes. Smallpox, measles, and influenza swept through the peninsula, decimating the populations. By the mid-18th century, the once powerful shell mound builders had vanished, their remnants absorbed into other groups, or taken to Cuba by the Spanish. Into this vacuum moved the Creek peoples from Georgia and Alabama, migrating south to escape the expansion of the British and American colonies and the conflict of the Creek Civil War. These distinct bands coalesced in the Florida wilderness to become the Seminole and Miccosukee. Their history in the Everglades is one of refuge and resistance. During the three Seminole Wars in the 19th century, the United States military attempted to forcibly remove them to the Oklahoma Territory. The Everglades became their greatest ally. The impenetrable sawgrass, the labyrinthine mangroves, and the sweltering heat baffled the U.S. troops. The Seminoles and Miccosukees knew every tree island and every slough. They developed a guerrilla warfare style perfectly suited to the terrain. It was during this time that the chickie was perfected. A chickie is an open-sided dwelling constructed from cypress logs and palmetto thatching. It is a masterpiece of indigenous architecture adapted to a subtropical climate. The raised floor protects inhabitants from high water and snakes, while the open sides allow the breeze to flow through, providing natural air conditioning. The steep pitch of the thatched roof sheds the torrential rains of the wet season and is designed to resist hurricane-force winds by allowing the wind to pass through the structure rather than pressing against solid walls. This mobile, rapidly constructible housing allowed families to move quickly to evade soldiers. The dugout canoe, carved from a single massive cypress log using fire and adzes, was their vehicle. These canoes were shallow-drafted, capable of gliding over inches of water and sliding through the sawgrass, yet stable enough to carry families and goods. The Seminole and Miccosukee developed a lifestyle completely synchronized with the seasonal rhythms of the Everglades. They planted gardens of pumpkins, corn, and bananas on the fertile, high ground of the hammocks. They hunted deer, bear, and turkey, and fished the waters with spears and nets. Their clothing evolved as well. The heavy wools and leathers of their northern ancestors were replaced by light cotton patchwork, often sewn in intricate, colorful strips that mimicked the patterns of the snakes and the play of light on the water. Today, the Miccosprain tribe of Indians of Florida and the Seminole tribe of Florida remain distinct sovereign nations. The Miccosukee, in particular, have retained a strong presence within the Everglades, living on leased land within the park boundaries and along the Tamiami Trail. Their traditional knowledge of the ecosystem, passed down through oral histories, provides invaluable insights for modern conservationists. They understand the cycles of the water and the behavior of the animals with a nuance that scientific data is only beginning to corroborate. Understanding the Everglades requires a deep dive into the atmospheric mechanics that drive the ecosystem. The climate here is classified as tropical savanna, bordering on tropical monsoon. It is the only place on the North American continent with this designation. The driving force of the seasons is not temperature, which remains relatively warm year-round, but rainfall. The wet season, or hydroperiod, is fueled by the Bermuda High, a high-pressure system over the Atlantic. In the summer, the system pumps warm, moist air from the ocean across the Florida peninsula. As the intense subtropical sun heats the land, the air rises, cooling and condensing into massive cumulonimbus clouds. These are not gentle rains. They are violent, convective thunderstorms that can drop inches of water in an hour. This distinct weather pattern is so reliable that one can often set a watch by the afternoon storms. The transition to the dry season is equally dramatic. As the northern hemisphere tilts away from the sun in the winter, the Bermuda High shifts, and drier, cooler continental air pushes down from North America. The rains stop. This dry down is the critical biological clock of the park. It is a slow-motion draining of the landscape. The water levels in the sloughs drop by fractions of an inch per day. This recession is the mechanism that concentrates energy. The small fish and crustaceans that reproduced in the vast flooded prairies during the summer are forced into the deepening pools of the main sloughs and alligator holes. This biological concentration is what allows the wading birds to breed. A white ibis or a wood stork cannot forage efficiently in deep water where fish are scattered. They need a density of prey that is artificially created by the shrinking water. If the dry season is disrupted by unseasonal rains, often caused by El Niño events, the water levels rise, the fish disperse, and the bird colonies fail. This fragility highlights how the entire reproductive success of the ecosystem hangs on the precise meteorology of the dry season. Hurricanes are the most violent expression of the Everglades climate, yet they are also agents of renewal. The ecosystem has evolved in the bowling alley of the Atlantic hurricane belt. When a major hurricane strikes, like the Labor Day storm of 1935, Hurricane Donna in 1960, Hurricane Andrew in 1992, or Hurricane Irma in 2017, the immediate aftermath looks apocalyptic. Mangrove forests are defoliated or snapped in half. Hammocks are stripped of their canopy. However, these storms perform essential ecological functions. The storm surge brings a massive influx of marine sediment and nutrients into the interior wetlands, fertilizing the nutrient-poor soils. The strong winds knock down old senescent trees, opening up the canopy to sunlight and allowing a new generation of saplings to race skyward. This maintains the diversity of the forest structure. The rack lines, ridges of decaying vegetation piled up by the storm surge, become incubators for new plant life. In the mangrove zone, hurricanes can actually deposit enough sediment to keep the islands above the rising sea level, at least temporarily. The resilience of the system is such that within a few years of a major strike, the scars are barely visible. The chemistry of the Everglades is as unique as its weather. The bedrock, the Miami oolite, is calcium carbonate, the skeletal remains of ancient marine life. This makes the water alkaline with a high pH. This basic chemistry is fundamental to the formation of the landscape itself through a process involving the periphyton. The periphyton mat, that golden brown algae soup floating in the prairies, is a biogeochemical factory. During photosynthesis, the algae remove carbon dioxide from the water. This shifts the chemical equilibrium, causing calcium carbonate to precipitate out of the water in tiny crystals. This whiting event creates the marl soil, a dense, gray mud that seals the bottom of the prairie and allows water to pool. Without the periphyton, the marl would not form, and the water would seep away into the porous rock much faster. Furthermore, the interaction between the freshwater Everglades and the saltwater coast creates a dynamic zone called the oligohaline zone, meaning low salt. This shifting boundary is where the battle for territory between the sawgrass and the mangroves takes place. Sawgrass has a low tolerance for salt. Mangroves can tolerate fresh water, but are generally outcompeted there. As sea levels rise, the saltwater wedge pushes further inland via the tidal rivers and through the porous groundwater. This subterranean intrusion of salt is invisible from the surface until the sawgrass begins to die back, replaced by salt-tolerant species. This transition is usually a slow march, but human reduction of freshwater flow has accelerated it. The freshwater pressure head, the physical weight of the freshwater pushing out towards the sea, has been reduced, allowing the saltwater to push in with less resistance. This process, known as saltwater intrusion, not only changes the vegetation but threatens the Biscayne aquifer, the drinking water source for millions of people. Let us look closer at the tree islands, the most distinct topographic features of the River of Grass. These are not random clumps of trees. They are organized, self-sustaining systems often described as the batteries of the Everglades because they store nutrients. There are two main types: pop-up islands and fixed islands. Pop-up islands form when a chunk of peat floats to the surface, often due to methane gas production from decomposition, and gets colonized by plants. Fixed islands, however, form on high points in the limestone bedrock. The head of the island, facing the current, is usually the highest point and supports the tallest hardwood trees, like the hackberry and gumbo limbo. The tail stretches out downstream, supporting ferns and smaller shrubs. The fascinating mechanism here is the nutrient concentration. The trees on the island transpire massive amounts of water, drawing groundwater in from the surrounding marsh. This water carries dissolved phosphorus and other nutrients. The island acts as a focal point, sucking in nutrients from the surrounding oligotrophic, nutrient-poor marsh and concentrating them in the island's soil. This allows the lush, tropical forest to exist in a landscape that is otherwise nutrient-starved. This concentration also makes tree islands hot spots for wildlife, but it makes them vulnerable. If water levels remain too high for too long, the trees drown. If the water is too low, the dry peat soil can catch fire, burning the island down to the bedrock and destroying centuries of accumulated soil and nutrients in a single day. The pine rocklands deserve a more microscopic inspection. This habitat is a global rarity, found only in South Florida and the Bahamas. The floor of the pine forest is a rough, exposed limestone crag, often called dogtooth limestone because of its jagged edges. Growing directly out of this rock is a herbaceous layer of incredible diversity. It is here that one finds the tiny, delicate wildflowers that exist nowhere else. The crenulate lead plant, the deltoid spurge, and the tiny polygala are endemic species that have evolved to survive in this harsh, rock-hard environment that is periodically scorched by fire. The slash pines themselves are fire-adapted in their life cycle. The grass stage of the pine seedling looks like a clump of grass, protecting the vulnerable bud from fire. Once the root system is established, the tree shoots up rapidly, getting its crown above the flame height of a typical ground fire before growing its thick, fire-resistant bark. The symbiotic relationship between the fungi and the pine roots, mycorrhizae, is essential for the trees to extract nutrients from the rock. In the coastal estuaries, the food web begins not with living plants but with dead ones. This is a detrital ecosystem. The mangroves drop tons of leaves into the water annually. These leaves are tough and waxy, inedible to most animals in their fresh state. However, once they fall, they are colonized by bacteria and fungi, which begin to break them down. This decaying leaf fragment, coated in protein-rich microorganisms, becomes a nutritious flake called detritus. This detritus is eaten by amphipods, shrimp, and mullet. These primary consumers are the base of a food pyramid that supports the snook, the tarpon, the osprey, and the crocodile. The mangroves are also viviparous, meaning they give birth to live young. The propagules, seeds, germinate while still attached to the parent tree, developing a long, cigar-shaped root structure. When they drop, they float horizontally. Over time, the bottom end becomes waterlogged and sinks, turning the propagule vertical. It then drifts until it hits a sandbar or mudflat, where it can root instantly and begin growing. This adaptation allows mangroves to colonize new islands and stabilize shifting sands. The role of the microscopic biological crusts cannot be overstated. In the marl prairies during the dry season, the ground is covered in a crunchy, blackish crust. This is a dormant state of the periphyton and cyanobacteria. Even when dry, this crust stabilizes the soil, preventing wind erosion. When the rains return, these microorganisms rehydrate and begin photosynthesis within minutes, jump-starting the food web. This resurrection ecology is a key survival strategy in a landscape defined by the oscillation between flood and drought. Archaeological investigations in the 10,000 Islands region of the park continue to reveal the sophistication of the pre-Columbian inhabitants. Recent LIDAR, light detection and ranging surveys, which use lasers to map the ground beneath the vegetation, have revealed the true extent of the Calusa's shellworks. These were not just mounds, but complex town plans with defined causeways, courtyards, and water retention basins. The court mounds suggest a highly stratified society with designated public spaces for rituals and governance. The sheer volume of shell material required to build these structures indicates a labor force and a central organization that challenges our understanding of hunter-gatherer societies. They were harvesting the sea on an industrial scale, using nets made of palm fiber to catch mullet in quantities that could support thousands of people. The sonic environment of the Everglades varies wildly by season. In the wet summer, the air is thick with the buzzing of insects, the croaking of frogs, and the thunder of storms. It is a cacophony of life. In the dry winter, the landscape quiets down. The insects are fewer, and the soundscape is dominated by the wind rustling the dry sawgrass, a sound often compared to the soft hiss of escaping steam, and the calls of the migratory birds. The silence of the remote backcountry is a rare resource in itself, offering a psychological escape from the noise pollution of the modern world. This acoustic distinctiveness is part of the park's wilderness character, protected alongside the physical resources. One of the most peculiar natural phenomena in the park is the poisonwood tree. To the untrained eye, it looks like a harmless, attractive tree with drooping, shiny leaves. It is, however, a relative of poison sumac. Its sap contains urushiol, the same irritant found in poison ivy but in a much more potent concentration. Standing under a poisonwood tree during a rainstorm can result in severe blistering skin rashes, as the water washes the oils off the leaves and onto the unfortunate hiker. This tree serves as a potent reminder that the tropical hardwood hammock is a defensive ecosystem, where plants have evolved chemical warfare to deter herbivores. Conversely, the gumbo limbo, often found growing right next to the poisonwood, is traditionally used as an antidote. Its bark is brewed into a topical wash to treat the rash, a piece of folk medicine that highlights the duality of the forest. The hydrological connectivity of the Everglades extends deep underground. The Biscayne Aquifer is a superficial aquifer, meaning it is close to the surface and directly connected to the wetlands above. The water in the Everglades does not just sit on top of the ground. It exchanges constantly with the groundwater. During the dry season, the aquifer can actually feed water up into the sloughs, maintaining hydration for the plants. Conversely, pollutants on the surface can easily migrate down into the drinking water supply. This intimate connection means that the health of the Everglades is directly tied to the health of the urban population's water tap. The Shark River Slough is the primary recharge zone for this aquifer. The phenomenon of bioerosion is evident in the limestone. While the rock is dissolved chemically by acidic rain, it is also eaten away biologically. Boring sponges, mollusks, and algae physically drill into the limestone to create shelters, slowly breaking down the rock and turning it into the carbonate sand that forms the beaches of the Keys and the floor of Florida Bay. This biological recycling of the geology is a continuous loop. Finally, the resilience of the Everglades is found in its seed banks. The soil of the wetlands holds a dormant library of millions of seeds. Some of these seeds can remain viable for decades, waiting for the right conditions to sprout. A fire might trigger the germination of one species, while a flood triggers another. This ecological memory stored in the mud allows the vegetation to recover from catastrophic events. When a hurricane scours the land or a fire blackens the prairie, the recovery is already waiting just beneath the surface, ready to seize the opportunity of the cleared space. This capacity for self-repair is the hallmark of the Everglades, a dynamic, pulsing entity that is never truly destroyed, only constantly rearranging itself in response to the water, the wind, and the sun. To comprehend the living, breathing skin of the Everglades, the vegetation and the wildlife that skitter across it, one must strip away the biological veneer and ascend into the stone that supports it all. The resilience of the seed banks and the adaptability of the fauna are recent phenomena when viewed against the deep time of the geologic narrative. The story of the Everglades does not begin with water flowing over grass. It begins with the sea flowing over stone, and before that, with the slow, blind construction of the earth itself. The stage upon which this hydrological drama plays out is a massive, submerged plateau, a testament to millions of years of marine persistence that established the foundation for the river of grass. The geologic setting of Everglades National Park is defined by the Florida Platform. This is a massive, table-like feature that juts out from the North American continent, separating the deep waters of the Gulf of Mexico from the deep waters of the Atlantic Ocean. While the peninsula we see today seems significant, it is merely the exposed top of a much larger carbonate bank, nearly 400 miles wide, that has been accumulating existence for over 150 million years. When the supercontinent Pangaea began to rift apart in the Jurassic period, the basement rocks of what would become Florida remained attached to the North American plate. As the new ocean basin opened, this basement rock slowly subsided, sinking beneath the waves. However, the water was warm, shallow, and tropical, conditions perfect for the proliferation of marine organisms. For tens of millions of years, the Florida Platform acted as a marine factory. Corals, mollusks, bryozoans, and billions of microscopic foraminifera lived and died in these waters. Their calcium carbonate skeletons rained down upon the seafloor, layer upon layer, compacting over eons into limestone and dolomite. Unlike the rest of the North American continent, which was built up by the erosion of mountains and the deposition of clastic sediments like sand and clay carried by rivers, Florida was built by biology. It is a biogenic landmass. The limestone bedrock of the Everglades is essentially a graveyard of ancient marine life, thousands of feet thick. This lack of terrestrial sediment is crucial. It means the water chemistry is naturally alkaline, buffered by the dissolved remains of ancient shells, which dictates everything from the clarity of the water to the types of algae that can survive there. The specific rock layers that form the surface of Everglades National Park, the floor upon which the visitor stands, are much younger, dating to the Pleistocene epoch, often called the Ice Age. This era, spanning from about 2.5 million years ago to nearly 12,000 years ago, was characterized by a rhythmic pulse of global climate change. Massive ice sheets would advance from the poles, locking up the world's water and lowering sea levels, followed by interglacial periods where the ice melted and the seas rose. The geology of the Everglades is the direct result of these fluctuating sea levels. The most prominent rock formation in the park is the Miami limestone. It was formed during the Sangamonian interglacial period, approximately 125,000 years ago. At that time, sea levels were roughly 20 to 25 feet higher than they are today. The entire southern tip of Florida was a shallow, submerged bank, very similar to the Great Bahama Bank of today. The water was agitated by tides and currents. As calcium carbonate precipitated out of the water, it formed concentric layers around tiny grains of shell or sand, creating small spherical beads called ooids. These ooids drifted in the currents, forming shifting sandbars and shoals. Over time, as the sea levels dropped, these oolitic sands were exposed to the air and cemented together by rainwater to form the oolitic facies of the Miami limestone. If you look closely at a piece of this rock today, it looks like fish roe turned to stone, a mass of tiny cemented spheres. This rock is incredibly porous and permeable, acting like a rigid sponge that allows water to flow through it with almost no resistance. To the west and north of the oolitic ridge, in slightly deeper and calmer waters of that ancient sea, a different type of rock was forming. This is the bryozoan facies of the Miami limestone. Here, colonies of tiny moss animals, or bryozoans, flourished along with calcareous algae. When the seas receded, their skeletal remains formed a rock that is less structured than the oolite, but equally important. Beneath the Miami limestone lies the Fort Thompson Formation, an older layer composed of alternating beds of marine and freshwater limestone, a geologic layer cake that records the earlier pulses of the sea. Simultaneously, while the oolitic shoals were forming the eastern ridge, a massive coral reef was growing along the edge of the platform to the south and east. This reef tract, composed of star corals and brain corals, would eventually fossilize to become the Key Largo limestone. This is the bedrock of the Upper Florida Keys. This ancient reef line is structurally vital to the Everglades because it acts as a leaky dam. It forms a crescent-shaped barrier that helps contain the fresh water within the Everglades basin, preventing it from rushing too quickly into the Atlantic. The Florida Bay lies in the shallow trough between the mainland and this fossil reef. The transition from a marine environment to a terrestrial one occurred during the Wisconsin glaciation, the last major ice age. As ice sheets advanced across North America, sea levels plummeted approximately 300 feet. The Florida shelf was exposed, and the peninsula became twice as wide as it is today. The climate became arid and cool. During this time, the exposed limestone was subjected to meteoric water, rain. Rainwater is naturally slightly acidic due to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. As it fell on the limestone, it began to dissolve the calcium carbonate, a process known as karstification. This chemical weathering pitted the rock, creating the jagged surface, the solution holes, and the subterranean channels that define the park's topography today. The red, clay-like soil, often found in these holes, is a remnant of Saharan dust, deposited over millennia, accumulating in the dissolving rock. This period of exposure also allowed the surface of the limestone to harden. Through a process of dissolution and reprecipitation, a hard crust called caprock or calcrete formed on the surface. This hard layer is often what makes digging in South Florida so difficult. It creates a seal that forces water to flow horizontally rather than immediately percolating vertically, although the solution holes punch through this crust, connecting the surface water to the groundwater below. About 15,000 years ago, the Great Melt began. The glaciers retreated, and the sea levels started their slow, inexorable rise. This is the Holocene transgression. As the rising sea captured the edges of the shelf, the water table inside the peninsula was pushed upward. Approximately 5,000 years ago, the water table intersected with the ground surface. The low-lying limestone trough began to hold fresh water. The climate shifted to the subtropical wet-dry pattern we know today. In this shallow, freshwater inundation, the plants took hold. The landscape formation of the Everglades is unique because it contradicts the standard geological model of delta formation. Most wetlands are formed by rivers depositing sediment carried from inland mountains. The Everglades, however, formed in place. It is a limestone depression that filled with water, where the soil was created by the plants themselves. As sawgrass and other vegetation died in the anaerobic, oxygen-poor environment of the underwater marsh, they did not decompose completely. The organic matter accumulated, layer upon layer, forming peat and muck. This peat accretion is the landscape building engine of the Everglades. Over the last 5,000 years, this peat has built up to depths of several feet in the sloughs. It is a biological soil sitting directly on top of a marine rock. This peat is highly sensitive. It requires water coverage to exist. If the water level drops for extended periods and oxygen enters the matrix, the bacteria oxidize the peat, turning it into carbon dioxide and causing it to vanish into thin air. This is the phenomenon of subsidence. In areas where the Everglades has been drained for agriculture, the land surface has literally evaporated, dropping by 5 to 10 feet in less than a century. The ground is quite literally burning away in slow motion. The directional grain of the landscape, the ridge and slough topography, is a subject of intense geological and ecological study. When viewed from the air, the tree islands and sawgrass ridges are aligned parallel to the flow of water. This alignment is not caused by the erosion of the bedrock, but by a self-organizing feedback loop between the water flow and the peat formation. Flowing water transports sediment and nutrients. In the historic Everglades, the water moved fast enough to prevent the accumulation of flocculent organic matter in the sloughs, keeping them deep and open. The nutrients were swept downstream or caught by the ridges, stimulating plant growth there. This differential peat accumulation accentuated the ridges and kept the sloughs clear. Today, with the reduction in water flow due to water management, this shaping force is weakened. The sloughs are filling in with sediment, and the distinct directional landscape is blurring, becoming a uniform marsh. This flattening of the landscape reduces the diversity of habitats available for wildlife. The hydrogeology of the park involves a complex interaction between 3 aquifer systems. The deepest is the Floridan Aquifer, a massive, pressurized system that underlies the entire state. However, in South Florida, the water in the Floridan Aquifer is brackish or salty and is confined beneath thick layers of impermeable clay. Above this lies the intermediate aquifer system, but the most critical player for the Everglades is the superficial aquifer system, specifically the Biscayne Aquifer. The Biscayne Aquifer is unconfined, meaning it is open to the surface. The water you see in the Shark River Slough is essentially the exposed top of the aquifer. The rock is so permeable that transmissivity rates, the speed at which water moves through the rock, are among the highest in the world. This means that you cannot effectively build a dam in the Everglades. The water will simply flow under it through the rock. It also means that the aquifer is incredibly vulnerable to contamination from the surface. The interaction of fresh and salt water in the underlying rock creates a dynamic subterranean battleground. Fresh water is less dense than salt water, so it floats on top. In a healthy state, the weight of the freshwater head in the Everglades pushes down and out, keeping the saltwater at bay near the coast. As the freshwater levels have been artificially lowered, the pressure is reduced, and the saltwater wedge moves inland through the porous rock. This is not just a surface phenomenon. It is a deep geological intrusion that affects the root zones of the plants and the chemistry of the solution holes. The color of the water in the Everglades tells a geological story. In the marl prairies, the water is crystal clear because the calcium carbonate precipitates out, dragging particles down with it. In the mangrove forests and deep peat sloughs, the water is often tea-colored or tannic. This coloration comes from tannins and dissolved organic carbon released by the decaying vegetation. While it looks dark, it is not dirty. It is a chemical soup rich in acids that can slowly etch the limestone bedrock, continuing the process of karstification even today. One of the more subtle geological features is the Rock Reef Pass. Within the Shark River Slough, the water flows through a subtle valley, but to the east, the limestone rises slightly to form the Atlantic coastal ridge. This ridge, only 10 to 20 feet high, acts as the eastern rim of the Everglades Bowl, preventing the water from flowing east into the Atlantic and forcing it to make the long turn toward the southwest. This ridge is composed of the oolitic Miami limestone, the ancient sandbar. It is the highest ground in the county and is where the cities of Miami and Fort Lauderdale were built. The history of urban development is dictated by this subtle topographic feature. The cities were built on the ancient fossil sandbar, while the park preserves the ancient lagoon behind it. The coastline of the park is a battleground between biogenic land building and physical erosion. The 10,000 islands are not rock islands, but shell and mangrove islands. They are built on oyster bars and vermetid worm reefs. Vermetids are marine snails that build hard, tubular shells cemented to hard surfaces. Over centuries, these worm reefs can build up significant structures that trap sand and mud, creating new land. This is a rare example of a mollusk-built landscape. As we consider the future geology of the park, we must confront the reality of the Anthropocene. Humans have become the dominant geological force. The levees and canals are artificial geologic structures that have rewired the hydrology. The interceptor line of canals was designed to pump water back into the park to create a hydraulic barrier against saltwater intrusion. This is geoengineering on a massive scale, an attempt to use pumps to mimic the pressure once provided by the natural weight of the water. The phosphorus legacy is another geological marker we are leaving behind. Phosphorus binds to the limestone and the peat. Even if we stop polluting today, the legacy phosphorus stored in the soil will continue to be released for decades, altering the plant communities. We are creating a distinct chemical stratum in the geologic record of the Everglades, a layer characterized by nutrient enrichment and the shift from sawgrass to cattail peat. The restoration of the Everglades is often framed as repairing the ecosystem, but geologically, it is an attempt to restart the landscape-forming processes. By removing barriers like the Tamiami Trail roadbed, we are not just letting water flow, we are allowing the sediment transport and peat accumulation processes to resume their work of shaping the ridge and slough topography. We are trying to turn the engine of the landscape back on. The story of Everglades National Park is a narrative of an unfinished world. It is a land that is still being born, rising from the sea, built by the bodies of the dead to support the lives of the living. It is a place where the rock breathes water, where the soil is made of grass, and where the boundary between the ocean and the continent is a shifting, fluid line. As we stand at the edge of the Paheoki Overlook, gazing out across the endless river of grass, we are witnessing a landscape that defies the rigid categorizations of the human mind. It is not land, and it is not sea. It is a shimmering, suspended state of being that exists between the two. The Everglades is a testament to the power of subtlety. There are no mountains here to command our attention, no canyons to demand our awe. Instead, the power of this place lies in its quiet, relentless persistence. It lies in the slow drift of the water, the microscopic architecture of the peripheton, and the silent accumulation of the peat. This park serves as a profound mirror to our own society. For a century, we looked at this water and saw only waste. We saw a swamp to be drained, a chaotic wilderness to be tamed and monetized. We waged a war against the flow of water, armed with dredges and dynamite, believing we could improve upon the design of nature. We were wrong. The collapsing aquifers, the dying bays, and the vanishing wildlife were the ecosystem's response to our arrogance. Today, Everglades National Park stands as a monument to a shift in human consciousness. It represents our admission that we cannot conquer nature, but must instead learn to participate in its cycles. The comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan is more than an engineering project. It is an act of atonement. It is the largest attempt in human history to heal a wounded ecosystem, to undo the damage of the past, and secure a future where the needs of the megalopolis and the needs of the marsh are balanced. It is a gamble, a massive experiment with high stakes, testing whether we have the wisdom and the political will to coexist with the wild. The future of the Everglades is uncertain. The rising seas press against the mangroves, threatening to drown the freshwater heart of the park. The pressures of population growth gnaw at its edges. Invasive species lurk in its shadows. Yet, there is hope in the resilience of this place. The alligator still bellows in the morning mist. The ghost orchid still blooms in the darkness of the swamp. The water still flows, seeking its ancient path to the sea. When you leave the Everglades, you do not shake the dust of the trail from your boots. You carry the memory of the water. You carry the realization that we are all downstream, connected by the flow that sustains us. The river of grass is not just a park. It is a pulse, a heartbeat that has rhythmically washed over this limestone platform for 5,000 years. It is a reminder that in the end, nature does not negotiate, it flows. And if we are quiet enough, if we are humble enough, we might just hear the wisdom in the water, teaching us how to survive on this fragile, beautiful blue planet.